Hey, you guys, I think I'm live. I always like to check and make sure and see that it's actually working. And if you guys cannot hear me, let me know. I'm going to give it a second. Okay, it looks like it's working. All right, you guys, good deal. I am back again today to talk about the two most important things that we need in a healthy relationship. I sent out an email to a lot of my subscribers. I don't know if you got it or not. You may have received it if you're on my list, where I shared with you that I was asked by a colleague of mine if I could narrow down everything that I've learned into just a couple things, what would it be? Like if I could only teach 2 or 3 things, what would I choose? And I was limited to those. And my objective to support healthy, authentic marriages was still the same, but I only could pick 2 or 3 things. What would it be? And it was a really difficult question for me at first because I always tend to think we need everything, right? Like, well, there's this and there's this, and all of it is important. But when I thought about it deeper and reflected on my own personal experience in transforming my marriage and working with other people in changing their marriages, it became clear that there's actually a couple of things that will result more outcomes for you than the other things. Like some things will give you bigger outcomes or you'll get more results for the same amount of work, right, than something else. It's like the 80-20 rule, the 80% of the outcome comes from 20% of the things that you're choosing. And so you want to be very strategic about what am I going to start with? What am I going to focus on first? And once you have that dialed in, everything else is just like icing on the cake. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about those 2 things. And those are boundaries and emotional connection. And they do relate to each other, they play into each other. But I want to start with boundaries first because that's the most fundamental thing, because boundaries are essentially just like the line between us and another person. So we have to start there. Like we have to start with first knowing who we are, like where we end and where another person begins. Because if we're absorbing too much of another person and confusing that with us, or if we're extending ourselves too far over the line and thinking that somebody else's stuff is ours, that's a problem, right? That is like a systemic problem in the relationship that results in many different symptoms. Like lots of different symptoms and problems come from that. I'm going to try to give you a handful of examples. There's too many for this live stream today, but if you think about boundaries as like that, there's that line, and I'm always talking about staying in your lane and what does that actually look like. And it's basically, on the most fundamental level, if we're stepping outside of our lane, there's 2 kinds of boundary violations. One is we're stepping out of our lane, and we're crossing over into someone else's area and messing with stuff that isn't our business, or we're overstepping, basically. That's a boundary violation. Another kind is when other people are crossing our lines, right? And so then we have to hold an external boundary to protect ourselves. But first I'll talk about this symptom that I see a lot when I talk to people, which is, and I'm guilty of this too, stepping out of our lane and talking about the other person. We mean well because we want to share what our intentions are, or our observations, or what we think their intentions are. So we want to share, like, this is what I'm noticing. This is what I think might be happening. But if we're talking about them to them, we're not sharing about ourselves. We're technically overstepping. So like if you're trying to tell your spouse what you think they're thinking, I mean, it's one thing to ask a question, right? But if we're saying, well, you did that because you were trying to avoid this, or you did it that way because you were trying to take a shortcut, or because you don't care about my feelings, or because you're not making our relationship important, or whatever the accusation is, it's a you statement. You're speaking to their intentions, you're speaking to their thought process and what something means to them or what they're feeling. And even if we're right, it's not healthy to be in the habit of always communicating in that way, because automatically that's going to create a defensive reaction most of the time. Unless you've been doing this for a while and you're involved, you can hold that boundary really firmly and say, that's not it, or yes, you're right about this, but not this, and you can hold your ground without having to be defensive, and that's the ideal scenario. But automatically, when somebody is leading with a you statement and speaking about you and your intentions and your feelings, and especially if they miss the mark or if they're attributing negative intentions to your actions, that's gonna, make the walls go up, and it causes a lot of fights. Like, people argue about that. Yes, that is true. No, that's not true. Well, this is what you said. No, that's not what I said. It starts with a boundary violation. Another way that this can happen is if, let's say, and this is just such a minor example, but it speaks to a boundary issue. If you notice something that is going on with your spouse, like maybe they're bummed out, or maybe they're being really quiet, and you think it's because they're mad at you, or you think it's that they're upset about something, they're holding on to resentment, whatever you're thinking it means, and you ask them what's wrong, and they say nothing's wrong. And then you go about your day and you still notice that they're still kind of quiet, and you're like, I don't think it's true that nothing's wrong. And you ask them again, and you give them opportunities to share what's going on for them. And if you have your own feelings about that, but you don't share your feelings about that, you don't say, I'm starting to feel anxious because you haven't talked to me all day and I'm making meaning out of that, right or wrong. What I would like is if you could share what I'm picking up on, if there is anything, or what's going on in your world. We don't come forward necessarily and share that now we're having an issue or we're having a feeling about them. We're still trying to get them to tell us something about them that they're saying isn't there, right? So that's an example, like, but something must be wrong. Why don't you just tell me what's wrong? And are you sure nothing's wrong? And they're like, yeah, nothing's wrong. And then you end up getting into an argument because really you don't accept that answer because you have feelings about the fact that they've just been really quiet, right? So the trick is staying in your lane and being like, I notice inside myself, I'm having a reaction, I'm feeling unsettled, or I'm feeling disconnected, or I just miss having a conversation with you. I'd love to hang out with you. It's harder to do that. It requires more vulnerability. It requires more self-awareness, and it requires more transparency. And we're not really trained to do that. In this culture, we're trained, especially, in my generation and older, to hide how we're really feeling. Like, it definitely isn't okay to share how you're really feeling. I mean, when we ask somebody how they are in passing, we don't really want to know. And we know that. And so we conceal as opposed to reveal, which healthy communication is revealing, not concealing. But that's not, it goes against sort of the dominant narrative of our culture and how we feel safe. So that's just another example of how you could get into an argument and have an issue in your relationship and not even recognize that it's actually a boundary thing. Another example is if your spouse is having a bad day and now all of a sudden you're having a bad day. Just because they're having a bad day, you're having a bad day, that's a failure of a strong energetic boundary. Or if they're mad about something, then you're mad at them for being mad because you don't like that they're mad. Their anger makes you feel anger, and now you're fighting instead of just saying, that's their experience, it doesn't have to be mine. And because it's not my experience, I can just be curious about their experience. And so in that sense, the connection is greater because the boundary is stronger. And we're going to get into that in a minute, in emotional connection. But that's one of the ironies, is the stronger that we have these lines, the greater connection we can have with each other, because we're not picking up what isn't ours. And we're clear to be able to receive the other person, and then vice versa, because then their walls go down as well. Another really common boundary violation is blaming and finger pointing, because basically, I mean, blame, if you've listened to Brene Brown, and if you've listened to me, I love Brene Brown. She has a really great short video. If you look it up, I think it's an animated video, just a couple minutes long, about blaming, and how blaming is just discharging of negative emotion. But it's also even more than that. It's discharging negative emotion that comes from a deeper assumption that our locus of control is outside of ourselves, that we don't have control. So now we're going to blame things outside of ourselves. I'm also a recovering blamer, and it was hard at first because then I felt like, well, how can I offer feedback without blaming? But when I learned how to do that, it made me realize how much power I have that I wasn't using, that I wasn't seeing, because I wasn't looking inward, because I was crossing over that boundary between me and others. So anytime we're taking our internal locus of control and putting it outside of us and holding others responsible for our experience, and if we do this habitually, that's a boundary issue, and that's where we need to start. Like, most people will think in terms of, well, I have to find a better way of saying that. And yes, that's true. We have to find better ways of offering feedback. That's what I teach people how to do, right? How do we offer feedback in a way that isn't blaming but is still honest? But that's not the first thing. The first thing is to have a sense of who you are and who you are not, and what is yours and what is not yours. That's a deeper knowing, and it literally informs everything else that we do. So if we can get that dialed in, then everything else it comes organically and naturally from that place. And we don't have to like constantly be working to override our default mode, which, by the way, always wins. No matter how much insight we have, no matter how much therapy we have, until we internalize that physiologically, which goes beyond insight, which goes beyond talking, which goes beyond verbal processing. If we don't internalize that, we're not going to be able to change those defaults. So some of the most foundational work that we do in transforming a marriage is the inner work of knowing what our boundaries are, and then internalizing the beliefs that support those strong boundaries, so that, for example, we don't have any limiting beliefs getting in the way. Like for me, holding boundaries with my kids brought up a lot of guilt. Like I had guilt around saying no. And so I had to change those beliefs and recognize that holding boundaries was actually not a mean thing to do. It was in the greatest interest of everybody that I care about. And once I was able to truly internalize that, then everything can grow from that. It's not, and I still have to remember that consciously sometimes, but it's so much easier now because of that. So yeah, like what I was saying, I'm looking at my notes here and I kind of already went ahead of myself, but once you know what's yours and what's not yours, and you live and embody that principle of honoring that line, then automatically when you communicate, you're going to be sharing of yourself. You're going to be staying in your lane, and you're going to be communicating in healthier ways automatically before you even have the tools, right? You're going to just instinctively know, well, that's not mine, that's out of my lane. So then what's left is sharing about myself and what's coming up for me. And if that's all you're doing, even before somebody's giving you the perfect formula, you're gonna be able to communicate so much better and be heard in such a much better way without even having to like memorize the tools or remember the tools. This is the most important thing. Now, boundaries in terms of being able to protect ourselves, I was talking a little bit about containing boundaries where we're not like stepping outside of our lane. Boundaries also mean being able to protect ourselves, knowing that we can close the door on any toxic elements that are not in service of us being a healthy person, or living according to the values that we hold, or modeling to our children what we really want to model. Boundaries that we know we can hold, external boundaries, are the ones where we can protect ourselves. If we really internalize this and know how to do this and feel comfortable doing this, we know that we can. I always use this fence analogy. Like if you know that you can close the fence to your yard, you have a fence and you can close the gate, then you don't have to sit on your front porch with a shotgun waiting for people to trespass, right? Like you don't have to be hyper vigilant about making sure to protect your property. You can hang out with a thing, a pitcher of lemonade, and invite people in and be generous of spirit because the boundary's there. And you know that you can utilize it at any time. You can open it, you can close it, and it's up to you. And once you know that and you trust yourself, you can be very relaxed. And this is important because I think we talk a lot about safety in relationships and how the other person has to respond to us a certain way in order for us to feel safe. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And having a truly authentic relationship with a person that we're really close to is not safe. Like it just isn't safe. We are taking a risk because on a primal level, we need to feel attached, which we're going to get into the emotional connection in a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. But basically, the bottom line is that if we know that we can hold a boundary, we don't have to worry about what the other person is going to do with what we share, or what they're going to do at all, like how they're going to respond, what they're going to say, because we know, like, you know what, if it crosses a line, or if it becomes abusive or toxic or completely derailing or table turning or just unfair, I'm out. I'm stepping out. I'm holding the line. I'm leaving the room. I'm not going to get pulled in. And when you have that boundary and you know that you can put that up and say, not as a wall, but as a conscious protective barrier for when you recognize this isn't what I want to let in, and I'm not going to let it in. When you have that inner strength to be able to hold that boundary, then you don't have like as many trust issues with other people. You're not like, first of all, you're not holding back and walling off as a way of like, well, I'm not going to take that chance. And you're also not giving them the power to destroy you. You know, I hear people saying, well, I just don't even want to open my heart because they could just destroy me. You know, if they say the wrong thing, that would just crush me. And I get that, I totally do, but it's probably because it's activating something from childhood that it feels unbearable. But as an adult who knows how to keep themselves safe, it can't really hurt you that much if somebody doesn't understand you. It does hurt. I mean, that's what we want. We want to feel understood. That's valid, but we're not actually unsafe. And the more that we know and trust in our own ability to say no, or to block something, or to say, I won't engage in that kind of conversation, I will engage in this kind of conversation, or as soon as you name call, I'm leaving the room, or whatever it is that's your protective external boundary, once you're really confident in that. Because it's not just communicating it and then them just doing it for you. It's that you actually have to hold it. And I've talked about this before. But when you trust yourself in that, then you don't feel like you're putting your whole heart and life into someone's hands. You trust them because you trust yourself. Because you know that if they are not worthy of your trust, then you will take care of yourself and you will do what you have to do. And that's priceless. I think that's the most fundamental thing. And when we have that, then the way that we relate to people in general is so much more generous. It's so much more connecting. This is why I tell people all the time, like, I see this a lot it's interesting. I see a lot of men of a certain generation who are a little bit detached or walled off, or they're not really receiving their spouse. And it's because they don't feel like they can say no. And so they're just going to shut something down right away instead of engaging or being open or being soft or being inclusive in the dialogue or the conversation. And it's not because they don't value the input of their spouse. It's because they feel like they have to go along with what their spouse is saying. They don't feel like they can say no, or if they think, if I say no, or if I say, hey, I love that idea, let me consider it, here's what I'd like to do, and it's not just an automatic yes, that it's going to be a problem. And so when you feel that you can't say no is when you're going to be less open to a dialogue or hearing that person's feelings or brainstorming or whatever the case may be. And you might recognize this in this example that I'm giving right now. I'm giving a few different examples, but you know what I'm talking about if this is something that you've experienced. Either your spouse has that issue where they feel they can't say no, and then they resent you, and then they're holding back from you, or you yourself struggle with that. So that's why it's so important to have these boundaries. When you own that and you know that you can say no and not feel guilty about it, and that it's not going to jeopardize a relationship, and you're not giving them that power, you can be so much more generous, and then you can be so much more connected. And that leads into the emotional connection piece that I want to talk about. If you can just imagine for a moment, let's say you have really strong boundaries. Picture having really strong boundaries if this is something that you are struggling with. And you can picture how, because you have these strong boundaries, or because your spouse has really strong boundaries, they're able to be a lot more generous, like that, front porch example that I gave. You can see how that would pave the way beautifully for emotional connection to grow and to thrive. And an emotional connection basically is, it's not emotional support, it's not expressions of your emotions, and it's not affection. Emotional connection is attunement. It's the mental presence and attunement of what your spouse is experiencing. And it's the knowledge, vice versa, that you can turn towards your spouse in distress and they will be there for you. It's like knowing that you have them in your corner. They've got your back. They're not going to judge you. It's safe, right? That's the safety piece. That is also very important in us feeling like we can be soft and lean in, and we can support our spouse in opening up by creating that safety just through emotional connection. Now, for those of you in this group, The Art of Healthy Authentic Marriages, you've already probably heard my masterclass with the couples code with the 5 shifts. And it might have resonated when I talk about emotional safety, that is so important to precede effective communication. Dr. Sue Johnson talks about this in her book, and this draws from old attachment theory, that she kind of brought old attachment theory back into popular psychology again, and talking about how it's actually not healthy for grown-ups to feel like they're only a grown-up if they are independent and not needing attachment from others, because we are in fact wired for that attachment, and we do need to feel it's like that balancing act, right? Like not holding them entirely responsible for our safety, because we have to have that boundary in ourselves, but to have a really deep connected relationship. The next step is to be able to move into that place of, I'm attuned to you and you're attuned to me. You see me, I see you. I can tell when something's wrong. You can see when something's wrong. It's that attunement that is connected to our physiological survival, so that we know that, like, if I'm in distress, I'm not going to die because another human being recognizes what I need and will step in and help me, right? Just not that we're thinking that. We're never thinking that consciously, that I'm going to die if this person doesn't hear me or see me. But sometimes we act like it, right? Sometimes we act like it's a life or death situation. That's why people scream at the top of their lungs, is because it feels like that, even though that's not really true. Just biological. Because if you think about it, when you feel unsafe, you're going to go into fight or flight mode, and you're not going to be able to communicate well. You're not going to be able to hear what they're saying in the right lens. And that's why this is so important. If you imagine it, let's say your spouse hasn't been paying attention to you for like 3 weeks. They're not really tuned into you. You've been having a really rough week at work. You've been having a hard time. They're not even asking you any questions, or when you do share of your own volition, they act like they're not that interested. And you don't feel close, right? They're not doing anything mean, but you don't really feel close to them. Then when they come and they share feedback with you, or they make a request of you, you're going to hear it more like they're your enemy, and you're not going to hear it through the lenses of, this person is on my side, this person is on my team. Or you're going to start looking for evidence of like danger, like evidence of like, see, this person's not here. This person doesn't love me anymore. This person doesn't even want to be with me, or whatever the fear story is. Whatever, if you have a trauma history that's getting activated by something that this other person, who knows, maybe they're checked out because they're having panic attacks and they don't want to tell you. We don't know always what's going on with another person. But the emotional connection piece is so important, because you want to be able to share. And if you feel that safety and you feel that connection and you know that they're there with you, again, it doesn't have to be perfect communication. You don't have to have the perfect words. You can speak your truth and feel heard. And when they speak their truth, you can hear it and you're not offended. You're just more likely to be like, all right, you have a different point of view and I have a different point of view. And but when you don't have that emotional connection, you end up spending all of your time trying to convince each other, because somewhere in your mind, you're not safe until you convince them, because then you can be together again. You don't realize that you can be together even with a different point of view. And when you have that emotional connection, and if you have experienced that, you know what I'm talking about. It's easy to say, oh, I want this and you want that. So what should we do? Like, as a team, we're going to figure this out, because there's no judgment. You're not my enemy. I'm looking at you through the lenses of love and teamwork, and I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt in all of your communications. And so that's why this is so foundational. You can have all the best communication tools in the world, but if you don't have emotional connection, either you're not going to use them or they're not going to be heard the right way, right? I'm sure you've had this experience where you like meticulously thought of how you were going to say something in an I statement and they just didn't hear it that way because the tone was still from a place of disconnection. And all they hear is the disconnection, and then that nonverbal communication is informing how they're going to receive you far more than the words that you choose are going to inform how they receive you. So that's what happens, when I talk to couples who are feeling like they're just roommates, where they're functioning logistically, but they just don't feel close, or they feel lonely even when they're in the same room with their spouse. That's the emotional connection piece. Once that's fixed, once you have that, everything else is so much easier. It doesn't mean it's still not worthwhile to learn communication skills or to learn the relational tools and skills to gain a greater mastery of emotional literacy and emotional intelligence and being able to identify what's really going on and what's at stake for you, to be able to recognize the meaning that you're giving something. And all of that is so important. But if you don't have the good boundaries and you don't have the emotional connection, the rest of it is going to fall to hell in a handbasket anyway. That's the truth of the matter. So if you're in a pattern that you feel like you're really stuck in, and whether it's 10 years, whether it's 20 years, whether it's 30 years, and you are wanting to do something about it and you're wanting to be a catalyst for change, that is where I recommend starting, is with those two things. First, boundaries, then emotional connection. Then you constantly are kind of going back and they each feed into each other. The emotional connection allows you to be stronger in your boundaries, and the stronger boundaries allows you to have greater emotional connection. And you could continue going deeper in that work, and that will only create an amazing foundation for everything else that you're working on, whether it's spiritually, whether it's you're trying to change your family life and improve that, or change how you parent and model something different for the legacy of your family. But that is the biggest bang for your buck, is focusing on these two things. I wanted to see if there's anything else I had written down that I wanted to share with you before I move on. Yeah, this is just kind of what I was saying, like, a lot of this is around vulnerability, of course. In order to have emotional connection, we have to be willing to be vulnerable and also be willing to make it okay for our spouse to be vulnerable as well. And that we often tend to think that that's just an emotional connection thing. Once we have that emotional connection, then we can be vulnerable. But having a good boundary is what supports us in being vulnerable too. Because when you're holding that strong boundary and you know the difference between me and you, then when you're sharing, you're automatically in your lane and you're sharing about yourself. And when you're staying in your lane and sharing, it's going to sound like, here's what I saw, here's what I made up about it, here's where my brain went, here's what my brain did with that, this is the meaning that I give it, this is the emotion that I'm having, this is where I feel it, my stomach is in knots, I feel like I want to run. And what I would really like is for this to happen, right? So when you're starting to talk about those things because you're staying in your lane, that automatically makes you vulnerable. So you might not have even been trying to be vulnerable, but just in holding your boundary and speaking from that place of that boundary, you're already primed to be vulnerable and to share of yourself. It doesn't have to be emotional to be vulnerable. It just has to be where it's like, wow, I'm really relinquishing complete control over everything that is on the other side of the line. And what if they're going to use it against me? Or what if they're going to judge me? Or what if I just don't like it in myself and now I have to speak that out loud? What if I'm judging myself for the fact that I'm having this reaction because I don't want to feel the way that I feel? And if I'm communicating that from my own lane, that is going to feel vulnerable, especially if it's something that you're not used to doing, right? That can feel absolutely terrifying. But boundaries allow for vulnerability, and that creates emotional connection. And then that emotional connection that gets internalized allows us to have that space between us. That space between us that allows us to preserve our own identity, our own values, our own life dreams, because they might not completely overlap, right? There may be some overlap, but your values and life dreams and interests and things that light you up are not going to be an exact match for your spouse. And the emotional connection that you build in the relationship, even if you have separate interests or different opinions, will allow you to have that separateness while still maintaining a sense of like security in the relationship. And then we have that healthy balance where we don't feel threatened, where we don't have to pull away for space, or where we don't have to like try to pull our spouse back in because we're having an insecure attachment feeling. So they all work together beautifully. And once you have those in place, pretty much you can do anything. You can hear your spouse from positive intentions when you have these two things in place. You can feel calm and confident in yourself, even if you don't know what's going on with your spouse. You know something's going on. You know that it's not yours, though, so you're curious and you're concerned, but it's not derailing you, right? And you're not going to start spinning out. You remain centered when these things are in place. Then you're also able to speak in healthy ways. You're able to share about you in healthy ways when you have this stuff internalized. And you're really able to hear what they're sharing as something about them without getting defensive. You can hear what they're saying, even if they're not saying it perfectly, even if they're saying it in a harsher way than you would prefer. But because you're so clear about the fact that it's not your stuff, it's easier to just hear it and get curious and be like, what does that mean to you? You know, what is that bringing up for you? How can I help you? Without picking up what's not yours, without defending yourself, without making it about, well, that's not what I meant, or, you know, then you end up going into that oppositional place. So that's another one of the benefits of being able to internalize these things, is that you can just hear people and then hold the limits with love. That's not an easy thing to do. I think a lot of times for women, it's not that easy to do because a lot of times our identities are formed as relational beings, that we get our identity through our relationships. But I find this so true for men I've talked to so many and worked with men who they don't realize it, but one of the biggest problems they're having in the relationship is that they're not emotionally connecting with their wives, and they're not able to do it because they don't feel like they can say no. They don't feel like there's not a strong emotional, or let me say it this way, there's not a strong internal boundary. And so that results in being, you know, pulling back as a way of preserving autonomy. Like, the only way that I can preserve my autonomy is to keep this distance between us, and I'm not going to be open emotionally, and I'm not going to share of myself, because either they don't trust themselves, or they've just taught that they can't really say no, because if it were to turn into a discussion, they're not really equipped to be able to articulate why something matters to them, or how they're feeling, or why they're feeling what they're feeling. They're not equipped, and it makes them feel a little bit out of their depth. So it's not just women that have a hard time with the boundary stuff. It's just maybe for different reasons sometimes, and it depends on the generation. But so many really, really good, high quality, decent men lose their wives after many, many years because they didn't learn how to say no. They didn't learn how to bring their full voice into the equation and trust themselves to be able to negotiate and collaborate, because that tension was going to be too anxiety producing. They were going to immediately feel like, this is conflict, this is fight, and this is a fight, and so I'm just going to not say anything at all. That's a boundary issue, and it takes people out, and it's really sad. But I think if you recognize this in yourself, it's never too late. I don't think it's ever too late to learn how to do this. It might be too late for the relationship that you lost already, maybe, although people do, once you learn new ways and you can build a new foundation. I've seen that happen too, lots and lots of times. But it's never too late for you to learn how to internalize that boundary so that you can have space between you without being walled off. Okay? And I think a lot of women lose really good men because they've been criticizing for years. Like, they've been criticizing, and they've been not from a place of mean-spiritedness, but from a place of despair, from a place of desperate attempts to be heard, and they just don't know the way to stay in their lane. And it's a vicious cycle. And so I talk to women also who are like, I realize now that there's no coming back from all the criticism of all, there's just, the foundation isn't there anymore. The confidence isn't there. The desire isn't there, because it's hard to maintain desire towards someone who does not see you in a positive light, right? It's not that you have to always be seen in a positive light, like just falsely, delusionally so, but when the ratio isn't balanced, the 5-to-1 ratio, which is also another really fundamental principle that is important to be focusing on. But honestly, once you have these boundaries and the emotional connection in place, the 5-to-1 ratio is already going to be so much higher without even tracking it or trying or focusing on any of the other tools. I know for me, like when I've had to set boundaries with my kids, I mentioned this earlier, where I feel guilty, but then I just get mad at them. Like I get mad at them for making me have to set the boundary. Like it's like that, well, don't make me get off the couch and have to like actually hold this limit right now. Don't make me have to do that, because then I'm going to be mad, because I don't want to have to set boundaries. I don't want to have to hold the boundaries. I don't want to have to remind you of the boundaries, because it's uncomfortable for me. So then I'm going to be mad at you for making me do that. How many parents have done that, right? I know that I'm not the only one that has that. And the more that you can come to terms with feeling okay about that, and knowing that it's actually in everybody's best interest, everybody's going to get the best piece of me if I honor my boundaries and if I'm consistent with those. And because then I'm not going to be mad at other people. Like it's okay for people to push the boundaries. It's okay for children to push the boundaries. And it's okay for our spouse to ask us for something. And it's okay for them to come forward with their strong voice and say, this is how I want to do it. But that doesn't mean that you also don't have equal say, that you can't come forward and say, I'm not comfortable with that. And so now what? Let's find a workaround. But it doesn't have to be like, well, now I'm setting a boundary, and so then that's just going to be conflict and we're all going to just fall apart. So that's why that goes so well with emotional connection, is that you have to have both really, but they feed into each other and reinforce each other so that you can move into collaboration and the us place, which is advanced. That's more advanced. High-level communication and collaboration and negotiating each other's differences without attaching meaning from our histories onto the situation is advanced work. And I would say, if that's what you've been trying to do and that's where you end up getting derailed, I would say table that. And this is what I do with my clients too. In the beginning, you're going to want to table the hot button issues because you don't have the skills yet. You don't have the foundation yet of the boundaries and the emotional connection to be able to do that successfully. So that's basically what I would recommend. And I tried sort of a nutshell version of my curriculum. As most of you know, I do the Couples Cure, which is a really intensive high support program. But last year, at the end of the year, I tried a 6-week workshop where I just focused on boundaries and emotional connection. I've extended it now to 8 weeks, and it went really well, and it was sort of like a beta version, and now I'm doing it again, and I'm starting it this week. So if this is something that really resonates with you, this is something that you want to learn how to do, it is a shorter program. It's a little bit more, it's more bare bones also, although you will be getting a lot of the fundamental things that I teach in the Couples Cure. But it's more accessible, it's a shorter time commitment, and it's also more financially accessible. So if it's something that you want to do, I'm closing the cart for it tomorrow night, Monday night at 11:30 p.m. Central Time. So if you have any questions about it, just reach out to me, private message me, email me. And I've also been sending emails out about it as well, if that's something that you feel like you want to hone in on. But I also want to open this up for Q&A right now on the call if any of you are with me still. I'm just going to check and see. And if you do, okay, Lisa, you had a question. What if the other person isn't willing to talk about anything? They just sit silent, staring off. Yes, they want to pretend like everything is fine. Yes. Okay, so that's a different kind of boundary issue where they're not coming up to the line, right? you don't want to cross the line, but then they're not even coming up to the line. They're not bringing themselves forward to meet you, right? So then there's that line between you becomes really, really big. It becomes this like massive like gap, right? That it's really hard to traverse. And when you try to cross it by asking, hey, what's wrong? And you want to get them to talk about it and they just won't, then there's really not that much you can do except share the impact that it has on you. You can come forward and share, hey, when this happens, this is how it impacts me, this is how I'm feeling, and then you can make a request. I would really love it if we could talk about this, or I'd love to hear what's going on for you, and you can make invitations and you can make requests, and then let go of that for a while. And then if nothing comes of it, you can bring it up again, try to get a yes, right? If you can get their buy-in on it, and relinquish the control over the outcome, but keep asking. It's sort of like when you think about successful people, like really successful people in business, like people that were authors and then, were rejected by every publisher a bazillion times before they finally had a bestseller. These are the people that just keep asking. They are not deterred. They're very positive. They're not angry about it. They're not acting out about it, but they just keep circling around. They keep asking from a positive expectation. And also, I recommend too, if you can lead with what it means to you and leading with your life dream. My life dream is to have a relationship where we really hear each other, where we really can feel close and where we support each other in what's most important to each other. And so towards that end, I would love to have a conversation about X, Y, Z. So you're leading with what you desire and why you desire it, and then you make a specific, tangible request and try to get a yes, no answer. And then, try to align it with what their values are too. Like, where is there something in it for that person when you're making a request? Sometimes it can be like, and I know that this is important to you too. Maybe we should sit down and talk about that. So I would have to do a deeper dive with you, Lisa, to see the specifics in your situation. But I think that when somebody is just shutting down, either they're flooded and they just can't communicate, or they know what they want to say, but they're afraid to say it because historically that was not okay for them growing up. And so physiologically it feels unsafe to share. It could also be that they're afraid that they're going to say it the wrong way, or that it's going to come out wrong. Lots of people overcompensate for what they think are going to be harmful impulses. And some of them, frankly, are harmful impulses. And they're like overcompensating for that by completely just shutting themselves off so that they don't react in the wrong way. It depends on the reason why that person is doing that. Sometimes people also just shut down because the other person's doing all the mental labor. If you're used to doing all of the emotional labor, they don't have any reason to do it, right? You're doing it all for them. And so when you leave that space sometimes and live with the disconnection, then you have to live with the disconnection for a little while. But if you're willing to do that and build up those strong boundaries for yourself and be okay anyways, they start to get connected to their own desire to want to share, or their own desire to want to be seen and heard, and their own desire to want to communicate or to reach back out to you across that divide. They get connected to their own desire for that when we remove ourselves from it, and it's not all just about our need for that to happen. It's a balancing act though, right? Because we do have to consider each other in a healthy marriage. And then worst case scenario, if we come forward and we ask our spouse to communicate with us and we clean up our side of the street and we remove all obstacles to that happening and it just still doesn't happen, well, then that's information for us to take on board and say, is this something I can live with? Is this the kind of marriage that I really want to have? And it might not be. It might be something that you were okay with. If a lot of people, when they get married really young, they're just marrying right into the default of what they're used to. And then as we grow and evolve, now I married later, but a lot of people will be like 20 years into their marriage, they're like, this is not what I want at all. It is what I wanted. And then you have to invite your partner in to grow with you. And a lot of times that can work. Like, hey, we're both growing. Where can we find our common ground? And how can we create a new culture for our marriage? And that's what the couples cure helps with, is really a radical overhaul when stuff has been deeply entrenched in a way that you no longer want it to be. So it's hard, but we can't make anybody do anything, you know. You might want to check out, Lisa, also the video that I did under the announcements tab. There is a video in there that is about, I think the subject is like boundaries versus ultimatums or something, boundaries and ultimatums. It's holding a boundary and making requests and standing firm on what we, like living according to what is acceptable to us and not participating in something that's not acceptable to us is not the same thing as an ultimatum or controlling what the other person does. But that is where our leverage is. All of our leverage in influencing our spouse or other people is through boundaries. Now, leveraging through boundaries doesn't work with a narcissist, so I'm just going to get that out of the way right now. Or if you're with a person who's abusive, not somebody who, I'm not just saying somebody who has engaged in abusive behaviors at times. I'm talking about an abuser type of person who needs to have power and control. That type of person and the type of person who's a full-blown narcissist, you're not going to be able to use boundaries as leverage and have a healthy relationship, but in most any other kind of relationship, boundaries is going to be where your biggest leverage is. But it's hard to do because when we start staying in our lane and holding those boundaries, we get uncomfortable. We don't want to go through the discomfort of doing that, and that's what derails us. It's not what the other person's not capable of. It's what we're not capable of to stand it out or to wait it out or to stand firm and be okay in the recalibration and in the discomfort and in the momentary disconnect. That's the other thing I was going to mention about emotional connection, as important as that is, and it is. Healthy emotional connection is not a straight line. It's something that you come in and out of, and it's something that you know. True emotional connection is something that when you have it, you can withstand the times that you don't have it because you know that you can have it again and you know it will come back, right? Like, oh, that person is just in the other room right now. They'll be back. It's like that on a psychological level. They're, really not as present this week, but that doesn't mean that that's always how it's going to be. That's what that emotional connection is the knowing, the deep knowing. It's not what's happening in the present moment. It's the deep knowing that you internalize with you, even when that's not being actively demonstrated right in front of you. So you could say faith is part of it, but it's really like that, just that deep knowing of the truth of the availability of that for you when the time is right. And it's not always going to be on our terms. And that's what a grown-up relationship is. A grown-up relationship is navigating where we don't line up, not expecting that it's going to be on my terms exactly how I want it all the time, just so that I don't have to feel discomfort. That's what a child deserves. A child deserves, a young child, it depends on what age we're talking about, but a child deserves that level of attunement and to know that they can reach out to their parent and have that secure attachment. Once that's internalized, then we don't need to try to get that from our spouse. But if we didn't get that growing up, there's a pretty good chance you're trying to get that through your spouse. And so then we have to be careful to find that balance because, yes, as adults, we do need that attachment. And so we have to be open to creating that. That's essential, but not from the adaptive child place where the degree to which it has to be or the level of unraveling that occurs if we don't have it right on our terms. That's when we can tell it's like, this is an adaptive child that's running the show. This is not the healthy adult kind of seeking of emotional connection. So any other comments? Okay, Lisa, cool. That sounds good. And then just let me know if you have any other questions. And if you are listening to this when it's not live and you're listening to the replay, if you have any questions, put them in the comments below and I will be sure to answer them. I'm also open for a free call if you want to book in with me at monikahoyt.com/talk. That's monikahoyt.com/talk. And whether it's about just anything I talked about here and you want to gain clarity on how that can support your relationship, or if you have specific questions about the marriage makeover, I don't think I even mentioned that. Marriage Makeover is the name of the 8-week workshop that is specializing in boundaries and emotional connection. So with that said, I'm going to sign off for today, but I am glad that you joined me here today, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Have a good rest of the weekend.